Coming up on This Week in Space, is Russia really building a nuclear space weapon? We'll talk with Space.com managing editor and military space expert Brett Tingley all about it. Plus, SpaceX has a launch date for their Starship rocket, and it's closer than you might think. We're 1 month away from the great North American solar eclipse, so mark your calendars for that. And is Voyager 1 on its last legs? We sure hope not, but we're going to all look into it on this episode, so tune in.
Podcasts you love
from people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is This Week in Space, episode 101, recorded on March 8th, 2024, Nukes in Space. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to This Week in Space, the Nukes in Space edition. I'm Tariq Malik, editor-in-chief of Space.com. And of course, it wouldn't be another week without my partner, Rod, being off exploring the Galapagos Islands or Ecuador or something. I really hope he has hugged one of those tortoises there, but we'll have to wait until he comes back. He can let us all know. But with us today, we're actually joined by one of my longtime colleagues, Brett Tingley, managing editor of Space.com. We're going to talk all about nuclear weapons in space. Brett, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, because I am not the one to ask about just what military stuff in space is going to happen. But first of always, we do have our traditional joke. This actually one was sent in from Rod, and I meant to ask it last week and I forgot. But here it goes. Here it goes. Hey, Brett, why did Pluto go to finishing school?
Why did Pluto go to finishing school? Oh man, I would love to have something witty to say, but I can't think of it. Let me have it.
So it could finally learn to be world class.
Excellent.
Get it?
Love
Get it?
it.
Because okay, I got the laugh track that one. That means that it's a good joke. Rod, if only you were here, you would be so proud. Of course, you can send us your jokes. You can join, Team Rod? Is that what it is? and send in a joke to us all here at Twist at Twit TV. Please, we need it because we only have so many of these corny jokes to go around. But coming up next, we've got a couple of headlines, and then we're going to get right to it. And the biggest headline for this week is SpaceX's Starship is going to launch next week. SpaceX, they sent an update. I guess it's kind of out of on X, their Twitter post, where they have set a date of March 14th, tentative. They actually don't have the full, the launch license from the FAA yet. That says they can try it, but at least they're confident they can to launch their third flight test of the Starship and Super Heavy booster. And this is, of course, their big, fully reusable, 400-foot rocket that they're trying to send to the moon for NASA to land astronauts. They want to fly it to Mars and all of that, but first they have to get it to orbit, and they have not been able to do that yet. So this is their third attempt. It might lift off about 8 o'clock in the morning local time on Texas, but we're still waiting to see if they have everything like ship shape for it. Now, they did tank the vehicle this week. That means that they fueled both the massive Super Heavy booster and the Starship vehicle at their Boca Chica, Texas Starbase proving ground in South Texas. It's the very southern tip of Texas if you're looking at the map there. And it seemed to pass it with flying colors. So we'll have to see if they're going to do any kind of engine test firings over the weekend, and if they're going to get that launch license. But Brett, you were actually on the short list to go cover this for Space.com, weren't you?
That's right. Yeah. Unfortunately, I just got back from the Crew 8 launch, which I actually didn't get to see because it was delayed. But yeah, hopefully I can get down there to Starbase to see one of these Starship launches, because the first two were absolutely spectacular. And we know all the others going forward are going to be just as spectacular. There's something so cool about a stainless steel rocket. I mean, that Starship just looks like something that was thought up in the 1950s. Say what you want to about it, but it's got cool factor. It's a very cool looking rocket.
And of course, I did see the first one, although it didn't get very high. It didn't even make it to space. It blew up right after lifting off. And Josh Dinner for space.com, he headed out there. By the way, that was from SpaceX, that story there. Our second story is actually from space.com, and I'm very proud for this one because Rod's not here to roll his eyes, but we are 1 month away from the great North American solar eclipse. So today is March 8th. It's also International Women's Day. So congratulations to women everywhere. But on April 8th is the actual total solar eclipse, the one that is going to cross from, it's going to actually cross from Central America and Mexico through Texas and then through states all the way kind of like northeastern diagonally through Maine and Canada. And everyone, if you get a chance to drive or fly to be in that path, you've heard me say over and over again that this is one not to miss. And of course, we've got our big preview out, but there was another story today even that said 99% just won't cut it. If you have 99% totality, you want to be in the total part of the eclipse. The nice thing, though, is that if you can't get there, most of the country will have in the 70% and up range of percentage of the sun that is eclipsed, which means if you have the glasses, you will be able to see at least something. But of course, it's that sliver, about 60-mile wide width across the country to be in totality that we want everyone to go see. And NASA's going to webcast it live. And we want to make sure that everyone is making their plans now. You don't want to be, going into the weekend, that weekend before April 8th, because April 8th is a Monday. If you're planning now, and then wondering what you're going to want to do. So be thinking about that now for everybody. I'm hoping to be somewhere upstate New York. Brett, are you going to go see the eclipse?
I am. I'm going to travel to Southeastern Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. They're having a huge block party. They're going to block off the whole city. There's going to be bounce houses for the kids. They're going to allow the community and the students of the university to come into the football stadium to watch it. I'm really excited. And it's right on the center line of totality. So I should be able to see a little over 4 minutes of the total eclipse.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I'm hoping to go to this kind of a scenic Lake Saranac in New York, just trying to work out some of the travel stuff on that end. And by the way, if folks out there are wondering, hey, what are some big ticket places to go see it? Dallas is in Dallas, Texas, is having a huge event there. San Antonio, Austin, having great big events across there. Cleveland in Ohio, and then Indianapolis. All these, these huge cities are all in the line. So, if it's cloudy, you at least have other stuff to do around those cities to check out. So this is the time to plan, because it's during spring break for a lot of people, and there's going to be probably a lot of big crowds. And then finally, I guess to end on a downer, we talked about this a little bit before, but it looks like Voyager 1, NASA's long-lived and the farthest spacecraft from Earth, still not doing well. The New York Times had a piece this week, and they weren't the only ones. Just kind of revisiting the fact that it's been months since November, that we've actually had anything that made sense come back to Earth from Voyager 1. It has some really critical computing problems. It is in contact with NASA, and they can talk to it a little bit, but they've been trying to diagnose a computer glitch for months now. They keep getting kind of gibberish back. They think they know what the problem is, but it's very difficult to reach the spacecraft because it's so far away. It's billions and billions of miles away out there in interstellar space. It's not dead yet, but Suzanne Dodd, the principal investigator at NASA's JPL, told the New York Times that this is, and she said, and I quote, the most serious issue that Voyager 1 has faced since she took over as project lead in 2010. So it's the biggest challenge that Voyager 1 has been facing. And, it's a plucky probe. It's about as old as I am. I think I'm 3 months older than Voyager 1 in terms of how long it's been out there in space. So, just the fact that it's lasted this long is amazing. But at least we have Voyager 2, right, Brett? So we've got a spare also That's in right. interstellar space if we need it.
Yeah. There's a lot of sentimentality. There's a lot of emotional attachment to them, something about the farthest thing we've sent into space from Earth. So I think everybody's rooting for it, but like you said, we still have another one.
Yeah. Yeah. By the way, if anyone out there is listening and has an idea about what NASA should do to try to wake up Voyager 1, let us know. And then we'll pass it on to NASA and see if it works. And we'll let you know then too. So, but we're here, Brett, to talk about space weapons and in particular, Russia's potential for some kind of crazy space nuke thing. And we're going to talk about that right after this next break. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are here with Brett Tingley, managing editor of Space.com, a colleague of mine who is the smartest person I know when it comes to military stuff. And he's actually been covering this story for us for the last few weeks. But Brett, welcome aboard. We're here to talk about Russia's potential new nuclear space weapon. Thanks for joining us today. Yeah,
thanks for having me. Big fan of the show.
I hope so.
Yeah,
because your reporting helps power it. So, I wanted to start just so that folks can get to know who you are, because you haven't been with Space.com forever. You had also all sorts of other experiences. Kind of who you are, how you found your road to space reporting, and in particular some of your military expertise to kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about right now.
Sure. Well, I started writing professionally about 2016. 2015, and started small, writing for a couple like weird news blogs. And during that time, I got really interested in spaceflight technologies, a lot of the weird sides of military technology, space weapons, things like that. And then around 2019, I started writing about military technology full time for a site called The War Zone. And it was during that time I got really interested in Space Force, anti-satellite capabilities, because these things have really been exploding, really been developing at this breakneck speed for the last 20 years or so. Really, the last 5 years, we've seen a huge explosion in the funding that Space Force has been getting, that DARPA has been getting to develop new capabilities in space. So I don't know if I call myself an expert, but it is something I have reported on, been researching for several years now. It's a big interest of mine.
And were you a huge fan of space stuff when you were a kid too? Like
oh, of course.
We hear from a lot of astronauts.
Yeah. It was Lego that got me interested in space as a kid. The classic Lego space series. And, I loved building radical, wild spaceship designs. And so I think that experience as a kid building these Legos got me so interested in this kind of stuff. And, I grew up during the space shuttle era, which was a huge thing for many of us, right? Yeah. The space shuttle was so iconic. It looked really cool. And I've always had a huge interest in space. Plus, science fiction was another thing that led me to where I am, Star Wars, Star Trek. But growing up in the 90s, we had several years in a row there where we had some really killer movies come out. Men in Black, Independence Day, The X-Files was going on during that time. And so all of that kind of combined together to create the interests that I have today.
Oh, that's great. And of course, now that it's funny that Lego got you into it. Now there's a whole new Lego space line that just came out this year.
Yeah.
But that's a great road to get here. And of course, you've got some bona fides there when it comes to covering military hardware in particular. So kind of walk us through like what's going on, because this story, we talked about it on the show here a couple of weeks ago as one of the headlines. Right. But it seems to have blown up and then is now just kind of sitting in the background while other politics and stuff are going on. So the big report was like last month, as we're recording this, basically that Russia has a new secret weapon that they could blow up satellites or who knows what in space. What's going on that we know about like right now? Can you give us like an overview of what we know?
Well, the good news is that according to the White House, there's no immediate threat to anyone's safety. Right? They're not saying that this is some kind of weapon that's hanging in the air above us with a nuke ready to come down. There's been a lot of chatter over the past few weeks, but from most of the experts, it seems like what we're talking about is some sort of nuclear-powered anti-satellite weapon, maybe a nuclear-powered electronic warfare platform. There have been a lot of great reports that people have done over the last 5 years to show that a lot of Russian industry has been working on this one particular design of this large nuclear-powered electronic warfare satellite. And what it could do is kind of disable a wide area of radio communications. It can jam satellites across a wide area. So that's one potential option.
Like
now,
an EMP or some other kind of active jamming thing?
More like an active jamming, like, radio frequency jamming, that kind of thing. Although, to your point there's also some speculation that maybe Russia's looking to revive the decades-old concept of actually detonating a nuclear weapon in space, which would be even more catastrophic across a larger area of satellites in orbit.
Now, and this is all still classified. It seems like it's kind of like a fluke that we know about it, right? So how did that become public in the first place?
Yeah, the intelligence itself is classified, but on February 14th, the chair of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, Mike Turner, a Republican from Ohio, he issued a public statement asking President Biden to declassify all the information that we have on this threat so that we can openly discuss how to respond to it. And there was a lot of back and forth with other congressmen. I think the next day there was a White House press conference because it just, the headlines just exploded. The story went crazy wide. So that's how we know about it. It's all because of, Mike Turner putting this out there. And there's been some speculation that maybe him even leaking that little bit of information might have been somehow politically motivated to drum up military funding, to kind of help push Congress towards approving some military spending bills, but we don't really know. That's all speculation.
Okay. So like spending for Ukraine or
That's
something
right.
like that. Yeah.
Right. Because, there's been a lot of back and forth on whether or not we should continue funding Ukraine at the rate we've been going at. And so obviously this big Russian threat that, might tip Congress in one direction. However, in that White House press conference, we did learn there is actually intelligence about an actual, Russian nuclear space weapon.
Okay.
But again, everything's pointing towards it being nuclear powered.
Like a reactor is what you're talking about. So you don't want anyone to worry that there's this giant. There's a movie from the 80s called DEFCON 4 or 5. I'm not sure. Have you ever seen that movie?
I don't think so.
It's absolutely awful. It's like one of the worst sci-fi movies I've ever seen. But the whole point is it's these two guys that are stationed on an orbital platform that just launches nuclear weapons down at the Earth. And of course, it's an apocalypse movie, so it all happens and then they crash and everyone's fighting over their crashed spaceship. But that's not what you're talking about. It's not like that. It's like something that if it's nuclear powered, I guess the point is that it needs a lot of power. So that's what they would use that for. And then they could keep it up there for a long time because nuclear powered stuff lasts a long time in space. Yeah. Yeah.
Electronic warfare, kind of these non-kinetic means of disabling satellites, they do require a lot of power. If you want to jam a wide band of radio frequencies over a long period of time, it's going to take a lot of energy. And so a nuclear reactor could be one way to power something that could stay on orbit for a long time and really disable communications across a wide area.
And nuclear. Go ahead.
Russia has signaled that it would like the capability to disable Western satellite constellations because, Starlink, SpaceX's Starlink mega constellation has been used widely throughout Ukraine to provide battlefield communications and government communications for the government of Ukraine. We had some statements come out several months ago from the Russian government that it considers even commercial satellites operated by the West as legitimate targets in wartime. So this capability, the ability to destroy, disable, or degrade Western satellites is something we know Russia and other nations like China are very actively pursuing.
To put it in perspective, because like you said, the White House was very adamant and the Defense Department too, because there were some briefings that we were following there, said many times that it isn't like a current threat. Like it's not something that's going to happen right now. It's not something that's in space right now that we know of. But it sounds like the ability to knock out or interfere with satellites at a scale that was described by these officials. It sounds like that could be a pretty damaging blow to just how we live. You and I are talking right now through like internet that gets bounced all around through communication satellites or when we travel and we use GPS and all of that. That stuff seems like a pretty large array of vulnerable systems because they don't have any kind of defenses built into them, right? All these commercial satellites, they're just designed to do the thing that they're built to do.
Yeah. Today's satellites are a little more hardened against radiation than the ones, say, 60 years ago. But to your point, yes, GPS satellites, all sorts of telecommunications satellites, would be entirely vulnerable. Many of these don't have the ability to change the orbits or maneuver out of the way in any way. It's for those reasons, the Pentagon has said, and Pentagon leadership has said in recent months, that space is the most vital domain for the U.S. military right now, because we depend on it at every level for all the things we just talked about: navigation, position, timing, communications, early warning for missile launches, all of those things. So yeah, if our satellites were taken out, if any nation's satellites were taken out, they'd be basically blind, deaf, and dumb to a large extent.
Yeah. I found, and John, for your records, there on line 43, I did find like a whole statement from the Defense Department about basically saying that space, that one is about hypersonic weapons. Pardon me. It's line 42 is the report that I had found, where they were saying that the space-based threats from competitors were like the biggest thing that we have to worry about, and that was back in 2022, and that was 2 years ago. So it sounds like it's just heating up, Brett, from what you're describing here.
That's right. And you just have to look at the launch cadence that the U.S. Space Force, these national security launches, they're going up more often. They're going up more rapidly. We saw the Victus Nox mission last year, in which the Space Force was able to turn around a satellite in a matter of days, right? They ordered it, got it on the rocket, sent it up, and they want to even increase that. There's another one coming up in which they want to shorten that window to hours,
Well, I want to ask about the military actions in space, because I have some treaty questions for you too. But you brought up a really good point about just the military ramping up its own actions here to do surveillance, to do reconnaissance, and defense. Of course, we have missile defense satellites, which are designed to detect launches from potential, what do you want to call them? Potential adversaries. But military participation in space, that's not new. That's been going on since the dawn of the space age. It was the first astronauts were purely from military backgrounds that we had, as well as in Russia and the Soviet Union.
That's right. And, some experts will argue that the entire space age is entirely a military operation. There's a fantastic book that came out last year by Bled and Bowen called Original Sin that delves all into this. But yeah, the original rocket technologies, they were derived from, military missile technologies. And even the whole concept of putting nuclear weapons in space goes back over 60 years. So yeah,
and was that just to put the weapons in space for quick strike, or to make stations where we're going to put them up there and, I guess, aim them down at Earth from the moon?
Well, as far as we know, it wasn't that nefarious. But as far back as 1959, the U.S. tested an anti-satellite missile that was intended to have a nuclear warhead.
Wow.
Now, they never did put a nuclear warhead on it. But yeah, 1959, this goes all the way back to that. So, for 60 years, we've known that one of the best ways to take out satellites was with a nuclear detonation in space. And back then, we didn't have the precision-guided missiles we have today. So a big explosion in space was the best way they had to do it. Luckily, President Eisenhower at the time took a look at it and said, this isn't a good idea. And they scaled back. But however, just 3 years later, in 1962, as part of what was known as Operation Fishbowl, the U.S. Air Force conducted a test called Starfish Prime. And about southwest of Hawaii, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, over Johnson Atoll, a little series of islands out there, they detonated around a 1.4 megaton warhead at an altitude of 250 miles, 400 kilometers.
That's where the space station flies. 250 miles up, yeah.
It was wild. When you see pictures and videos of it, I mean, it turned night into day. It created auroras on the other side of the world, on the other hemisphere. It street lights on the ground below went out, and it's estimated about a quarter of the satellites that were in orbit at the time suffered some kind of damage. And they did. That was only one of 5 that they did as part of Operation Fishbowl. So,
5 tests. We'll have to get some links for that so that folks can follow up on that, because that is crazy. That is crazy.
Yeah.
So, and did they launch all 5 of those tests like one after another, or were they like kind of spread out over like a few?
Yeah, they were kind of spread out, but they all took place in the span of a couple of years right then in the early 1960s. And so it's because of those tests that we know a lot about what the effects of detonating a nuclear weapon in space would be today.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to imagine even contemplating that kind of a test like right now, because you can't hide any of that stuff with the types of satellite surveillance that we've got going on these days. Well, I actually have a lot of questions about if it's even legal to do a lot of this stuff. I did have one just to follow up, because you mentioned early on that this potential weapon capability would be nuclear powered rather than like a missile or a bomb or whatnot. And that seems like it's not new either. Nuclear reactors in space. I mean, there were some nuclear powered satellites even during the early days of the space race, right?
Sure. And to go back to the Voyager probes we talked about earlier, right? These are radioisotope thermal generators. Is that what they're called?
Yeah, radioisotope.
Which is not quite the same as a nuclear reactor, right? They use the heat generated as an isotope, a radioactive isotope decays. But that, you can still consider that nuclear powered in a way. But it seems like what this new Russian capability might be is an actual nuclear reactor.
Okay.
And, DARPA and NASA are pursuing a nuclear powered propulsion system. So, Russia's not alone in that. But yeah, the nuclear powered rocket, that concept goes back, to the dawn of rocketry, basically. Because the space age was the same as the atomic age, right? All of these technologies were being developed kind of at the same time. So, yeah.
It's crazy. It's crazy that it's coming back now. Well, we're going to take a really quick break. But when we come back, we're going to start looking at what the UN has to say about all of this stuff. So don't go away. All right, Brett. So you've painted kind of a bit of a scary picture about this stuff. I guess it's good that we know that this is something that Russia is actively looking into so that we can be watching out for it. But I was of the mind that there has been a treaty in place from the United Nations that says specifically that we can't do those things, right? That this outer space peaceful uses treaty that the UN has, it says very clearly that states shall not place nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on celestial bodies or station them in outer space in any other matter. That seems pretty clear about putting weapons in space. So I guess kind of what do you know about that outer space treaty, and then how would that apply to what we know that Russia may be looking into right now? Right,
and that's been the big question as reports of this reported Russian capability have surfaced. This outer space treaty of 1967, or its long name, Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States and the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies. It very clearly, as you just read, prohibits weapons of mass destruction in space. However, that has not prevented things like Starfish Prime, that test that we talked about earlier. China, just in the past few years, tested what's known as a fractional orbital bombardment system, or FOBS, FOBS, in which they launch a spacecraft on a polar orbit, and just before it makes a complete orbit, it re-enters the atmosphere. And, ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, they travel through space, right? And we've never, to my knowledge, actually tested an ICBM with a warhead on it. But so it seems like the treaty has some gray areas in terms of traveling through space as opposed to actually just putting them in space. But to your point, it very clearly and explicitly bans putting them kind of in orbit, right? A loitering nuke, as they're known, that would just be there on orbit until it's called to drop. Those are very clearly banned. The problem with the treaty, as I've heard from some people I interviewed this week for an article I did at space.com, is the enforcement of the treaty isn't very clearly defined. Yeah. Treaties can be broken. This treaty in particular doesn't really have any clearly defined consequences about what would happen if a nation were to break the treaty.
So there's not like a there's not like a cop, a police, that
That's right.
some kind of thing like that they would have to answer to?
Ultimately, it would be the United Nations. But as we know, China, Russia, and the U.S. all have permanent seats on the UN Security Council. And so it can be very hard to enforce penalties against any one of those nations. Sanctions appear to be probably the go-to punishment, but even those in today's age are difficult to enforce because of the way international banking is now. It's very easy for nations to kind of move money around. We've seen this with the Ukraine war. The United States has put these huge sanctions on Russia. And as we can see, as the war enters its third year, they're still able to wage this war. So that's kind of where the treaty reaches its limits, is in the enforcement of it. What do you do if a nation violates it? And there's not really a good answer for that.
Is the answer a new treaty, or is it establishing some kind of body whose job it is to police space at all? Right. Like well, there's another 1990s TV show for you, Space Police, 2099. People should look that one up too. That was a good one. So that was a great Lego space series. That's right. I have one of those too.
Yeah,
those sets.
I love that theme.
But I guess
that's a big question, though. Yeah, that's a big question. And we published an article this week at space.com asking that same question. Is it time for a new outer space treaty? I spoke with Sharon Squassoni, who's a professor of international relations at George Washington University. And she said the hard part is the transparency aspect. Mm-hmm. Russia under Vladimir Putin has been very good at kind of hiding certain weapons development programs, about getting around treaties, not being completely transparent with the international community. And, we see the effects with the Ukraine war. So we could try to put a new treaty out. And in fact, in 2008, Russia and China proposed a new treaty along these same lines, and the United States did not want to go along with it because they felt it was targeted towards kind of crippling U.S. capabilities in space. So this has been proposed before. Mm-hmm. It's bubbling back up now with these reports. Everybody I've spoken to agrees that the difficult part will be in the enforcement.
That brings to mind, it seems like when it comes to anything in space, that is like that's where things break down. Like we were talking about Russia and China and the U.S. all have plans not just to work in low Earth orbit, but to go to the moon, and to use its resources to do other stuff, make air out of the ice, but it's all in one place. And what's to stop, one company, one country from going, into someone else's, base or whatever, and saying, no, we're going to take this stuff there too. And there's laws for uses of the moon and stuff there too, but there isn't a force that's supposed to enforce all of that stuff. And even without nuclear weapons in space, and I don't know if I'm getting on a soapbox here, but you can just aim your satellite at another satellite and have it move over time to encroach and mess some stuff up that way, by crashing. And we saw in 2007, is that right? 2006, we had the two satellites that crashed into each other, a defunct Cosmos satellite and an Iridium communication satellite, which was active, by the way, at that time. I think that was 07. Maybe it was 04. I got my years wrong. Someone correct me. Write in and send me a note to refresh my brain there. But it caused these two huge clouds of debris that are traveling, around the Earth right now. And then China did the same thing to create another satellite debris when they blew up a Fenghan weather satellite at that time too. And those weren't nuclear, capable things at all. It's just space junk. And I did see a report by the Union of Concerned Scientists of the U.S. Where they're just worried about the implications of space debris from these types of these types of measures that can knock out different satellites. And John corrected me. It was February 10th, 2009. That was the collision of the Iridium satellite and the Russian Cosmos. Thanks, John. Thanks for looking that one up. So it sounds like there's other just basic concerns that we have to be thinking about, because anything can be a weapon in space. You could have a power beaming satellite that you just focus it a little bit too robustly, and it can mess other things up there too.
That's right. And that's why we've seen initiatives like the Artemis Accords in the U.S., where we're trying to get nations to sign on and agree for these peaceful principles of cooperation on the moon and in space. China and Russia have their own kind of, international coalition for moon plans. And but it's a huge question as anti-satellite capabilities develop. We've seen, to your point about debris and satellites kind of following each other, Space Force leaders have been saying over the past couple of years that U.S. satellites are under attack almost daily. Now, these attacks, most of them are what they call reversible attacks. So it might be a laser shined right into the optical sensors of the satellite from another satellite to blind it as it's passing over, say an airfield or something. If China or whomever doesn't want us spying on them, they'll just point a laser right at the camera on our satellite. And we can even do that from the ground. Mm-hmm. There was a report we reported on either in 22 or 2023, I don't remember when, about Russia developing this huge ground-based laser facility that can beam these powerful lasers up at satellites to blind them. And there's many ways we can do this. We talked about jamming, electronic warfare earlier. There's all sorts of satellites now that can shoot projectiles into space. We've seen reports of these over the last couple of years, Russia testing them, China,
and even some satellite cleanup technologies that are like that.
That's right.
If you have a satellite, that can go up and grapple on to an older satellite to refuel it, then that it can grapple onto an older satellite and do some stuff that maybe isn't as nice as gassing it up or fixing it up or even deorbiting it properly. If you can deorbit a satellite at the end of its life to clean up space junk, you can deorbit a perfectly fine satellite and ruin someone's day there.
One of my favorite things I've reported on, just because of how wild and science fiction sounding it is. In 2021, the Chinese Shenzhen-21 satellite shot out a grappling net and grabbed onto another satellite and towed it into what's known as a graveyard orbit. It'll get farther and farther away from Earth. So to your point again, if it can do that to a dead satellite, what's to stop it from doing it to a live satellite? I think about these propulsion jetpacks, as Space Force calls them. They want to develop these little modular systems that can go on and grab onto another satellite and then propel it into a new orbit. But again, what's to stop it from just grabbing onto an enemy satellite, adversary satellite, and pushing it down into Earth's atmosphere? So there's some wild new capabilities being developed in terms of anti-satellite technologies that are going to play out in interesting ways if we ever do see a conflict between space superpowers.
I do want to ask a couple of final questions about that. Let's take the one really quick break, one last one before we get there, and then Brett, you can clue us in on what you think is coming in the near future for us all to watch.
Sure.
So Brett, you mentioned a lot of different things. We were talking about anti-satellites, and I guess at the core, what we know about this potential capability that Russia is developing is basically like what is it? The Moab, the mother of all like anti-satellite things. Basically, instead of shooting a missile from the ground, which missile defense satellites can track fairly regularly because we've got a lot of those types of satellites, you would have just something up there lurking that you can activate as like a surprise, where you have a lot of these satellite mega constellations. How many Starlink satellites are there right now? There's like 4,000, right? Something like that.
Over 5,000.
Over 5,000 satellites.
Yeah.
And that's just one company alone. And Iridium had plans for some. Amazon has plans for some. And that's just for communication satellites and internet satellites, let alone the GPS stuff that the military and our infrastructure needs to go. So do you see, or can you see a situation where there is kind of like an unstated space race now to develop these things? Because if the U.S. doesn't have this capability, and it sounds like the U.S. doesn't, although they probably wouldn't tell us if they did, right?
That's right.
That one of the reports that I had seen in the New York Times was that this was a capability, and it was one that the U.S. had no idea how to counter at this point in time.
Yep.
Is this going to spark like another space race, but a space arms race, as opposed to, a geopolitical race to get astronauts to the moon, which is kind of already underway with Russia partnering with China on a potential moon base in the near future, not really committing to the Artemis Accords, that sort of thing. But is that going on in the background now, do you think, or should we be worried about that kind of a military arms race for now?
I would argue it is already going on and has been for some years. Just a couple months ago, DARPA put out a call for proposals for new space weapons. And the Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA, has been publishing these annual reports every year about threats in space. And we know, there are things as wild as chemical sprayers that can, spray corrosive chemicals onto another satellite's solar panels, which would cause them to start tumbling because of it would cause an imbalance in how the solar radiation interacts with the solar panels. So I would argue we are already in the midst of a kind of a Cold War in space, or a space arms race. Mm-hmm. And, all these tests that we talked about earlier of these new anti-satellite capabilities over the past 20 years are kind of the way the public can see that this race is going on. I think I mentioned it earlier, but just a couple years ago, I think it was 2020, the chief of the Space Force said, we're under attack every day in space. Even Senator Bill Nelson, the NASA administrator, said just a couple months ago, we're in a race. We're in a race against China to get to the moon. And that's a whole other podcast episode is why is there so much military interest in the moon right now? Just this week, we saw China wants to put a network of surveillance cameras on the moon to watch over its moon base. And you got to ask yourself, why do you need surveillance cameras to watch your moon base if you're not expecting somebody to come tamper with your moon base?
Yeah, and to that point, I think DARPA has put out reports on military uses for quote unquote cislunar space.
That's right.
And it's just, it always raises the question: why would DARPA and the U.S. military need to have satellites in cislunar space when that's so far from Earth, where the rest of us live, right? So, so clearly, I guess there is some far thinking ahead that these military powers are looking at as another high ground. But it feels to me, Brett, like a bit of a regression back to that us versus them mentality that powered a lot of the space race in the 60s, the Cold War in the 70s, in the 80s. I mean, we had during the Reagan era a whole Star Wars program, right? With things from not just from missile defense satellites, but for space-based lasers, to shoot stuff down and all of that. And of course, it ended up being a whole lot of money with very little overall to show for it. Although it did spool up an industrial base for aerospace military projects that we are still using this day. But it feels like a bit of a throwback to that we're slipping into that kind of mindset when we really could be using all of this new technology to do maybe more benign and constructive things in orbit together. Yeah,
that would be preferable, wouldn't it? Unfortunately, I think if you look geopolitically, what's been going on over the last decade, we are kind of regressing back into kind of a Cold War, East versus West mentality. China and the U.S., are kind of vying for supremacy in the South Pacific, and there's been a lot of satellite maneuvers to spy on each other's activities, naval activities in the South Pacific lately. And obviously with Russia's ongoing war on Ukraine, it feels like the Cold War kind of all over again. And so I think that what's been going on down here on Earth is just kind of extending up into space. We're this East versus West kind of second Cold War thing. But as you mentioned, the first Cold War, the space race led to a lot of technological development that led to peaceful uses, and hopefully we can see the same thing today. I mean, we all want to see humans back on the moon, and the Air Force and Space Force might have great military interest in that, but how great would it be to see a moon base? So as unfortunate as it is to see these military tensions rise again, I think, as people like us who watch space flight, it's a very interesting time.
We've talked a lot about like Russia and this potential for a nuclear powered weapon in space. But you did remind me that, you know, the U.S. Space Force has been testing a classified robotic space plane in orbit, the X-37B. In fact, I think there's one in space right now, right? Yes. Doing who knows what in geostationary orbit somewhere. And China has their own now that they've been flying to Shenlong that can do its own separate things in space. Russia doesn't have one yet that we know of. But clearly that stuff has been going on in the background for a while. So I'm curious what you see the end result being, because do folks need to, like right now, should they be worried and looking up? Is it just something to know in the background along with all the other news that we have to deal with on a regular basis, or should we start practicing duck and cover drills again? Like I think you and I had those drills when we were in school. So
yeah, let's hope not. I think there are more pressing threats to be worried about than any kind of space nuclear weapon right now. As we've heard from the White House, this isn't anything that's going to be imminently launched. You know, there are still thousands of ICBMs on either side pointed at each other with nuclear warheads on them right now. So, like I said, I think there are more pressing threats to be worried about than any kind of reported space weapon. But, you know, to go along with what we've been talking about, it's just kind of one more thing thrown on the pile of this kind of growing tension between the East and the West and the growing militarization of space.
Well, we'll have to see how that develops over time. If we learn more about it, definitely, Brett, we'll want to have you back. Thank you so much for taking the time out to speak with us. I'm wondering where folks can follow you if you've got a new update, a new story about this or something else in space. I know you're working on some other supersonic tech stuff in the background, but that's a secret because we'll have to wait until that story comes out later on. It's okay. But where should folks follow you, and where can they find you on the computers?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Brett Tingley, just my name with no spaces or punctuation. And as always, find me at space.com. I'm over there daily reporting on the stuff we talked about and more.
Great. And for me, of course, you can find me at space.com, just, right alongside Brett there. We are getting very excited for the upcoming Starship launch. So we'll be following that pretty closely. And of course, I am on the Twitter the X, we're supposed to say, at Tariq J. Malik, and on YouTube at Spacetron Plays. It's a new season of Fortnite right now. All Greek gods and whatnot, maybe a little bit of space. I'll have to look into it. There's some constellation stuff I'm very excited about, but you can find me playing that. So maybe we'll see you in a game there. And of course, don't forget to check out space.com, because the website is the name. And the National Space Society, which is Rod's haunting and stomping grounds at nss.org. Both are great places to satisfy your spaceflight cravings. And of course, you can always drop us a line at twis@twit.tv. That's TWIS at twit.tv. And we welcome all your comments, your suggestions, your space jokes and ideas. And we really read every one of them. We love getting your comments, and Rod will answer every message. And I try to as well. New episodes published every Friday on your favorite podcaster. So make sure that you like and subscribe and tell your friends, and give us 5-star reviews, 6-star reviews. That's one more than Rod asks for. So please help me show him up. And of course, a thumbs up will always do nicely. You can also catch us at our website at twit.tv/TWIS. And you can get all of the great programming on the Twit Network ad-free on Club Twit, as well as some extras that are only there and available. Like, as Rod likes to point out, me falling off the chair, but I ordered the replacement parts and they're on my porch now, which means by next episode, I might actually have a working chair, and you'll never see that again. But Club Twit, that's $7 a month. That's like 2 coffees, right? And you can, you've heard Leo talk all about the tough times facing podcasters. This is your chance to step up, be counted, help us out, and find out some cool Easter eggs on the side. You can follow the Twit Tech Podcast Network at Twit on Twitter, and Facebook, and twit.tv on Instagram. And we will see you all in the next one. Rod comes back next episode. I can't wait. It's been great being here on my own, but looking forward to having him back in the co-pilot seat.